Good afternoon. My name is Michael Mitchell, and my topic today is the Texas Federal Writers Project, and it is the theme of my dissertation for the University of South Africa, Pretoria, to which I am a doctoral student. The title is The Lone Star on Relief, the Texas Federal Writers Project. Okay, a little intro on me. I am a community college professor at Houston Community College. I have been since 2005. I'm also the library director at Houston Community College Southeast Campus since 2009. This research of mine has been a part of my life since 1993. Sorry about that little pause. My master's thesis was at North Carolina Central University, and it dealt with North Carolina, and I went from it at the role of the writers in it. So on this one, I'm actually looking at the state offices, the state office that was in San Antonio, in direct reflection within the national office, and of course the local offices. The Federal Writers Project was the white-collar unit of the WPA. It was established in 1935 because Harry Hopkins, who was then the head of the WPA, believed that writers too had to have a way to make a living. And the way I put forth to my students is, I don't think to a certain extent you would want a white-collar worker building your house or digging your ditch. So for those who had education, sometimes we had stenographers and typewriters as well, typewriters. They needed jobs, and this is how this was filled out. Under the head of one Henry Alsberg, he and his staff were housed in Washington, D.C. And the idea was to actually have these folks compile information from each state into a plausible and credible state guide. And you need to think back in the 1930s. This isn't like today where we can just Google information, or you actually have the AAA or mobile travel maps. Many folks in different states didn't know about the other states, or even not only did they not know about the other states, they didn't even know what was beyond the ridge or beyond the mountain. And this was also during a time when travel was starting to become the norm. And so the idea was to build an encyclopedic state guide that dealt with each state. And so you would have the flora and fauna, the history and such. And then it would bring it up to modern times for the 1930s and it would focus on different cities. Okay. So in that case, there were 48 states, and of course Alaska actually did have one, and so did Hawaii. They weren't states, of course, at the time. And each state had that kind of template to build. There were issues. I know you would probably find that hard to believe. We're talking state guides, but in Massachusetts there was actually a kerfuffle, as it were, that dealt with communism. Seriously. And then in Missouri, the state director was handpicked by the local operatives, the Democratic operatives, state-run machine, and Alsberg just could not handle it because she couldn't get the job done, and it was actually closed down for almost 2 years. So there were issues. Unfortunately, or fortunately, actually, Texas didn't have these issues, not to this extent. But there were issues in the same, and I'll get to it eventually. In Texas, it was under the direction of J. Frank Davis. He was a former newspaper man from Massachusetts. And he did himself quite well until eventually, and from my readings, it seemed like he was tired of living in Massachusetts, and he had heard great things about Texas. And it led him not only to move here, but he wrote a book about the Texas Rangers. So I guess it was that lore of the wide open spaces, of Texas being kind of like the last frontier. So he thought, all right, I'm going to move down here. Well, in Allsburg's mind, especially when he was starting to find these folks to fill in the positions, he wanted those that had had some management experience or newspaper experience. And Davis filled out that as well. One side note I wanted to tell you about some of the state directors. When you look at the Federal Writers Project, it was probably one of the most egalitarian parts of the WPA. You had a lot of women directors. North Dakota, Minnesota, Alabama, South Carolina, just to name a few. You had city directors that were women. Houston was one. And so it was quite enthralling as you read some of these state reports that were coming in that there were women that ran these. And these are major states, as it were, and some minor, but either way. And for in the 1930s, it was quite interesting. And so in Texas, it was under the auspices of J. Frank Davis. Now, in the state WPA, it was run by Harold Draught, a man. He came from a good money family. I guess you could say it that way. Was well known, well thought of, and he ran the WPA quite well. As I'm doing more and more research on him, but in this instance, as opposed to some WPA directors that weren't quite happy with the Federal Writers Project, Draught actually was very supportive of all of the white-collar units. The Federal Theater Project, Music Project, Art Project, and the Music Project. And the Writers Project. So in that, Davis, I'm not going to say had free reign, but he didn't have as many obstacles to go through as some state directors did. There were 6 district offices, patterned just like the WPA. The 2 of the district offices, their paperwork is gone. I cannot find them. But what's interesting is that what I found was, especially in the Amarillo part, that northern part of Texas, it was run by a lady who was a superintendent of the schools. And by the way, after she had left, she ended up becoming quite the prolific writer and ended up writing 4 books, I believe, on her. 2 of them actually were influenced by what she saw in the folklore part of the Federal Writers Project in Texas. In the district offices, you had different San Antonio was part of one, San Antonio, Austin, Dallas was part of one. Houston was actually part of East Texas. And their goal was to get all this information to the state guide. Because Texas was so massive, and because there was turnover in 36, 37, 38, they really couldn't get everything on task. Unfortunately, by the time 1939 rolled around, Dyes and his committee of the HUAC went on a witch hunt after the WPA, and unfortunately the white collar project got hammered really hard. And Texas lost a lot of employees because of the cutbacks. And because of that, but instead of the government running it, it was the state government ran it. Now, they were able to get this massive 700-plus page book out, but only by Hastings Press in mid-1940. It came out to good reviews. You can actually get it to this day. It's actually online. It's actually online in free press. There are different animals to it. I only have 15 minutes here, so I won't really get into it. It's actually in my prepared writing that I turned in. The state guide was published. It went through at least 5 editions. There were also city guides to Houston, San Antonio, Dallas, Austin, and others using the same template that was done for the state guides. There were local guides, La Villeta, which dealt with the very, I don't want to say ancient, but old part of San Antonio. They were trying to make sure that it didn't get torn down. So this was kind of like a revitalizing effort. There's one on the hospitals in Dallas, strangely enough. There's also another one on the Riverwalk in San Antonio. And by the way, just another aside, the Riverwalk was actually built by the WPA. The first part of it was actually built by the WPA, as were the amphitheater in San Jacinto Monument and the roads that were leading to the San Jacinto Monument, and also the reflecting pool. The Federal Writers Project made its mark on the hiring of women, some Hispanics. Unfortunately, in African American hiring, as I have found out, I've only found 2. And that is actually part of, and you'll see in the handouts, that's part of what I've been trying to find is the influence is of DC onto the the San Antonio office. And as far as hiring in that Northeast liberalism that came down during a Jim Crow era, and did it affect the hiring? And did it affect the writing and how Texas was portrayed? And actually it did, as you'll see in part of it, that some of the bias within the state guide you can see is definitely reflective of the era of what was going on. Now, strangely enough, if you read Massachusetts, if you read the Virginia guide, if you read the North Carolina guide, the same biases I found out are kind of the same in Texas. But Texas, it's well, again, if you read in some of the city guides, especially in Houston, when they're dealing with the different wards that house the African Americans, some of the wording is quite right. Anyway, but even to that point, the Federal Writers Project actually had Sterling Brown, who was the head of the African American side of the Federal Writers Project, and his job was to oversee, especially what was coming out of the South on these state guides. And interesting enough, it went through his folks, and he let it go. So that being said, that's kind of in a nutshell what the state guide was. That's a nutshell what the Federal Writers Project was. Eventually, it went away in 1943 because of World War II. And after the state guide and the local city guides were done, after Henry Alsberg was essentially fired in 1939, Newsom took over, who he was the state director of Michigan, and they brought him in to essentially just clean it up. So anything that was done folklore-wise, and there were a lot of things that were done folklore. There were 3 publications that came way later from the Federal Writers Project in Texas. And when I say way later, I mean 80s and 90s and almost 2000s did this get published. So there's still a plethora of information out there on the folklore side. On the slave narratives, there are 2 books that are written for the Texas state, the Texas state side. So there's still enough there that are housed in the Library of Congress, to which, if someone has enough energy, there it is. So after it was cut down and Newsom came in and cleaned everything up, 41, 42, and 43 saw them writing essentially guides for servicemen. I know in Texas there was one for the servicemen that were coming into San Antonio, that were coming into El Paso. And this is kind of a cleanup work. Because again, after 41, there was virtually no unemployment, so there was no reason. So that is kind of a quick overview of the Texas Federal Writers Project. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.